Gastelum when I go in the octagon is I know you have a lot of respect for Michael Bisping, but tonight is about you. And I think on this show today, we're probably going to spend more time talking about Michael Bisping than we are Kelvin Gastelum. And I think that's okay because there are a lot of different angles to this Bisping performance and everything leading up to the fight. But we got to lead with Kelvin Gastelum. This guy's 5'9" tall, Kenny. And for my money, he's probably the biggest power puncher right now in this UFC middleweight division. Maybe he's the natural welterweight.
Right.
But I mean, dude, 6 knockdowns in his last 5 fights. I mean, he has knocked down. Forget knocking out, right? Knockdowns. I love knockdowns, right? I think it's an underrated stat in MMA. He has knocked down Michael Bisping, Tim Kennedy. He knocked Chris Weidman down, Vitor Belfort. Dude packed some serious pop, and I think that's why Jason Perillo and others in the Bisping camp maybe did have a little bit of pause as to just how dangerous a matchup this was for Mike.
Kelvin is an extremely dangerous fighter, both at 170 and 185. He's coming into his own as a striker now, and that is a scary thing. He's learning how to really rotate his hips and feet over to really create that power. And coming from that wrestling and grappling background, I think he was always a competent striker. He was always dangerous, but it was always to kind of set up a takedown, or it was, maybe the danger of his volume and variety as a striker at one point. But now the fact that you need to watch out for his left hand or for his right hook, that's a problem. That is a problem for a lot of people in that division. I personally would like to see Kelvin at 170. I think that's where he can be a true champion. I don't know if he can be a champion at middleweight. I definitely think he can be a champion at welterweight. I think he's a little bit small for that division, but geez, I mean, look at his performances right now at middleweight. He probably doesn't have to cut as much weight. He feels like he has the energy there. He obviously has the power. He's getting knockouts. He's getting knockdowns. I'm not sure I can really debate that at all as far as, his performances at middleweight. But as far as moving forward and becoming a champion, I would like to see him eventually at welterweight. But, man, Kelvin is an amazing fighter right now.
Well, from a size standpoint, it's hard to envision him, squaring off with someone like Luke Rockhold or a Jacare Souza, right? But the champ and the interim champ right now are former welterweights in George St. Pierre and Robert Whittaker, and certainly the move has worked out very well for Robert Whittaker, who is the UFC interim champion. That's the fight that Kelvin Gastelum wants. I mean, there are a lot of people that think KG can be a 2-division champion. I'd like to see him stay at 185 pounds. He still needed the towel to make 186 pounds, and discipline hasn't always been his strong suit. And I think there are still some issues with that, but it's amazing how much this guy brings to the table and just the rise from the Ultimate Fighter. He just turned 26 years old. As we spin it forward, who would you like to see next for Gastelum? Do you think that the Whittaker fight in Perth has any legs? I mean, that sounds like a pretty quick jump to me. From number 8 or 9 in the world, you beat the number 2 guy. I don't know. What do you think is next for KG?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know if he deserves to jump over some of those guys that are ahead of him in the middleweight division. I don't know if he's ready for that quite yet. Could he beat Robert Whittaker? Yes. I really think that maybe he could beat a guy like Robert, who's a little bit smaller as a middleweight, but climbing up the rankings as he goes up against the Yoel Romeros and the Luke Rockholds, those guys are going to be really tough for him just because of their size and their styles. But, I think those guys would probably get the shot, but I don't know. Maybe you put him against one of those guys who are, 7'6". Where's David Branch right now?
Yeah, that fight would make some sense. I think he's in and around that top 10. But is he coming off a loss? Or no, I guess he rebounded after the Rock. He fought Rockhold and Jotko. I get them all mixed up, dude. But
David
Branch,
he is coming off. He is coming off a loss. So, but someone in and around that spot, and it's tough because he just beat a very high-profile fighter in Michael Bisping. I really think he would have walked through Anderson Silva in the same manner. I think Kelvin is that good against those guys. The older generation of fighters aren't going to be able to contend with someone like Kelvin Gastelum. You're going to need a very large wrestler who can really strike and who's going to be a big middleweight in order to stop someone like Kelvin.
So 185 pounds, Kenny, will always be there for him, right? And let's be clear, you're not advocating some crazy weight cut for him to get down to 170. No, because it's not. There's the body fat to be lost, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And like you said, I think discipline has been kind of a problem for him in the past. I still think it is a little bit. He was young, and he still is young. What is he, 26 years old or whatever? So I still think, he can manage his weight much, much better. He does like his food. Yeah, and he's one of these guys, man. He is a gamer. He's one of these guys that people have been talking about for a long time that in the gym, he's okay. He's good.
Right.
He's solid. But when it comes to fight night, he's a completely different guy. He can beat anyone in the world at 185 and 170 if Kelvin is on his game.
And I just think that Tim Kennedy win, what that can do for your confidence when you're staring across the octagon, right, at the American sniper who looks like he's a heavyweight, a light heavyweight, whatever. I think that really helped in terms of some of the size issues. But, yeah, a guy like Weidman is just going to be a real problem for someone like Gastelum. I guess I just feel like if you're going to try to make a run at welterweight, and again, I'm not saying this year, but it's got to be sooner rather than later, right? 185 pounds is always going to be there. I think we both agree it's maybe a quicker and an easier path to the championship at 170 pounds, just given the size. So I don't know. If he doesn't get the Whitaker fight or doesn't get the fight that he's looking for, maybe he sits down with Dana and really sort of implores him to let him try once more at welterweight, where he would be, I would think, one win away from that rematch with Tyron Woodley that he so desires. So Michael Bisping, Kenny, not really much else you can say in terms of this guy's legendary status, all-timer, at least in terms of his accomplishments, top 15, top 20 mixed martial arts fighter of all time, going to be in the UFC Hall of Fame. But most people felt like taking this fight 3 weeks after the George St. Pierre fight, in which he sustained appreciable damage and was choked unconscious, was ill-advised, bordering on irresponsible, and the result in this fight, I think, certainly doesn't hurt those who were arguing against this, Kenny. Your thoughts on Bisping and a night gone wrong here in Shanghai for him?
Yeah, this is a tough one because, when I talked to Mike, I asked him, hey, what do you think about this turnaround? He said, I love it. He's like, I didn't suffer any damage against GSP. I'm ready to go. I'm going to get another nice payday. And we're going to go at him. He liked that fight against Kelvin. And I think Michael is capable, again, a lot like Kelvin, of competing and beating anyone at middleweight. He just has that toughness. He has that belief in himself. He's a guy who knows how to come back from adversity during fights. And I think a lot of people in his camp and him himself believed that he was going to go out there and get this win against Kelvin and come back and maybe do one more and then retire. But obviously it didn't work out that well, that way. Kelvin is a very dangerous fighter. He's an excellent striker. Ended up catching Michael Bisping off balance. Michael overcommitted on his right hand, I believe, was thrown off balance, kind of got square with his stance and really opened himself up to a tremendous counter from Kelvin that took him out. So, it's tough because, again, you can only kind of go by what the fighter says, right? And while Michael Bisping did get knocked down or kind of stumbled during the fight against GSP, he didn't get knocked out, right? He didn't get knocked out. It wasn't like he was TKO'd or anything like that. It wasn't like he took a series of blows that were really damaging where everyone was kind of covering their face. He got choked out. It was a grappling move, right? So I don't know. I think it's kind of easy to look at it now and say, well, we kind of wish Michael didn't take that fight. And maybe he shouldn't have. Maybe he shouldn't have. But just to give another argument, a lot of fighters kind of go in there thinking that, I didn't take a lot of damage. I could take this fight on short notice and get it done. I'm already in shape. But, the two back-to-back weight cuts, I know those weight cuts weren't good. That's not something you want to do a whole lot. He did take some damage against GSP and then getting knocked out again. It's not a good thing. It isn't.
Well, and he looks subdued on his way to the octagon. Dan Hardy said as much when we were doing our post-fight stuff, and he just didn't have that same look in his eye that have accompanied his previous 28 UFC fights, Kenny,
Well, that's interesting because I think that for a fighter, you get up for all these fights, right? Michael has been in some of the biggest fights in UFC history, from UFC 100 all the way to his last fight against GSP, and getting up for it, being that excited for it, all camp, getting ready for that huge event, and then kind of getting ready for this event in Shanghai. While, it's a big fight against Kelvin, it wasn't the fight in Madison Square Garden. It wasn't UFC 100. And maybe you don't have that same kind of focus. And also coming off the high of his last fight, even though it was a loss, there was a huge buildup to that. and going into another camp where he was probably already pretty exhausted physically, mentally, spiritually, that could be, the bad thing about doing a quick turnaround. And those are one of those things that only Michael Bisping knows. Maybe we're looking too much into it, but those are all certainly factors for looking from the outside in.
We're going to have Brian Stan on the show in a bit. New segment called Take a Stand. I mean, we couldn't do better than that. I'm trying, hopefully going to be a monthly staple of the show and give Brian a little bit of an outlet now that he's no longer working as a UFC commentator. But I know he has some strong opinions on this, and I think if I'm reading into the text correctly, some concern for Bisping given how it went down. But Kenny, in terms of the weight and the dehydration and the long flight and everything that accompanies that, you're far more the expert than me, so I'm throwing it your way, and maybe it's nice of me to be able to pass the baton. But Bisping had to cut 30 pounds. He had to fly to Shanghai, which dehydrates the hell out of you. You knew he'd make the weight. Mentally toughest athlete that I've covered in my career. But you couple all of that with the quick turnaround and whatever damage was sustained. And I don't know how anyone, and maybe it's retrospective, but anyone other than his financial advisor could think that this set of circumstances would produce the desired result other than a nice direct deposit.
I tell you what, you make a lot of good points. It's a balancing act, and I think one of the things you mentioned there, one of the most mentally tough fighters you've ever dealt with, and a lot of times number one, and I think for Michael Bisping, a lot of times we put so much credence on that, and we go, well, Michael knows, he's tough enough, he'll be able to pull it off. But a lot of times fighters don't know. So, while a lot of times the camps and the coaches need to defer to the fighters, a lot of times they need to kind of step in there and go, you know what? Yes, it's a great payday. Everyone's going to get paid. This is going to be good for you. It's going to be good for the bank account. Is it best for you? Is it best for your brain? Is it best for your body? Is it best for you as a father moving forward? And a lot of times we get caught up in saying, you know what? Give me this check right now. But how is this going to affect you later on in life? And that's the thing. I know Michael Bisping is a dedicated husband and father, and I would hate for this to be an issue going forward. He has had a lot of crazy fights, but it's hard to put a price on your brain. It's hard to put a price on your body, and I really pray and hope that this doesn't affect him. Anytime you see a friend get knocked out, anytime you see any fighter get knocked out, it's hard to see because, we've all been in those situations. I've been lucky that I haven't been able to, that I wasn't never knocked out during a fight or during a training session, but doesn't mean there's any damage there. You can get hit and not get knocked out, and there could still be a concussion. So there certainly are their dangers every time you step in there.